In a small town in southern Germany, for the better part of 50 years, a stranger could not walk down the main street without being quietly examined. Not the face, not the coat, the feet. People would glance down, first thing, at the shoes a stranger was wearing, and only then decide whether to nod or to look away. Children learned it before they learned much else. Old men did it without noticing they were doing it at all. The locals had a name for the habit, told with a kind of rueful fondness, the story goes. The town of bent necks, because there were 2 shoe factories in that town, facing one another across a narrow river. And for 2 full generations, almost everyone in it, every worker, every child, every shopkeeper, very nearly every dog, was expected to choose a side. One family had built them both. 2 brothers under a single roof, out of a single wash kitchen behind their mother's house, who fell out so completely and so bitterly that the quarrel outlived the both of them, and outlived their children too, and settled instead into the paving stones of the town where they were born. Tonight, the story of those 2 brothers, of a laundry room and a bicycle, and a war, of 3 stripes and a leaping cat, and of a small town on a small river, where, for half a century, a person's shoes did the talking before they did. But before we begin, close your eyes, breathe deeply, let your shoulders sink into the bed. If you enjoy these quiet histories, consider subscribing, but only if it genuinely helps you rest. And before you drift off, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. I'll read everyone in the morning. It's good to know who's out there, in the dark, listening along. And one small promise before we set off: any adverts will only ever come before the story begins. We never interrupt the story. It's how we keep the fire lit. Tonight, the story of 2 brothers who built something remarkable together, in near poverty, with almost nothing, and then spent the rest of their lives making sure the world knew they had stopped speaking. You don't need to follow every detail. You don't need to remember a single name. Let it drift past you, the way a river drifts under a bridge, going about its business, indifferent to whoever is watching from the parapet. We begin before the feud, before the stripes and the cat and the river became a kind of border, before either brother had a company or a rival or a grievance worth keeping warm for the rest of his life. In a small shoemaking town in Bavaria, where, the story goes, a young man came home from a war he was almost too young to have fought in at all, and began quietly in his mother's washroom to try to make a better shoe. You don't need to hold on to the town's name, or the river's name, or any name at all tonight, just the shape of it. 2 brothers, 1 workshop, a slow, ordinary river, going about its business long before it ever occurred to anyone that it might one day divide a family in 2. The town was called Herzogenaurach. Herzo, the locals say, when they are in a hurry, which in that part of Bavaria was not often. The name probably has nothing to do with any duke at all. The Aurach most likely comes from an old word for the aurochs, the wild ox once at home along a river like this one, and nobody now living can quite say why Herzogen. The duke's was tacked onto the front of it later. It is the slow, narrow river that comes down out of the Franconian hills and passes through the middle of the town on its way to somewhere larger. It is not a grand river. In places you could throw a stone across it without much effort. But it had been there a very long time, and the town had grown up along both of its banks, the way towns do, without much thought as to which side was which. For a long stretch of the 18th and 19th centuries, Herzogenaurach had been a weaving town. Looms in half the houses, cloth going out to Nuremberg on the cart roads, But cloth, in the end, is a trade that machines can do better than hands, and somewhere in the last years of the 1800s, the town's weavers began, one family at a time, to put down the shuttle and pick up the awl instead. Shoes, it turned out, were harder for a factory in some distant city to make cheaply than cloth was. A shoe still wanted a human hand at the last, and the bench and the eye. So Herzogenaurach became, within a generation, a shoemaking town instead of a weaving one, and stayed that way. By 1922, by one careful count, the town held 112 working shoemakers, out of a population of only 3,500 people or so. Set those two numbers beside each other for a moment. Something close to one household in 10 in that small town earned its bread from leather and thread. You did not have to explain the shoe trade to a child growing up there. You breathed it. It was in the smell of the streets on a warm afternoon, leather and glue, and the mineral tang of tanning liquor drifting up from the workshops nearer the river. Every trade leaves its mark on the sound of a place, as well as its smell, and this one left its mark early in the morning and late into the evening. Before the shops opened, before the church bells had rung the first proper hour of the working day, there was already the small private percussion of the shoemaker's trade drifting out through open windows. The tap of a hammer, setting tacks, the scrape of a knife trimming a sole flush, the creak of a lass being turned in a vice. None of it was loud. All of it together was the sound the town made instead of silence. You are standing for a moment in one of those workshops. A low room, a single window, a bench worn pale where 2 generations of forearms have rested on it. Church bells carry in from the old parish tower, marking the hour the way they had marked it for 500 years, and nobody in the room looks up. The sound is simply part of the day, like the light itself. A lass stands on the bench, a wooden foot with no leg attached to it, and around it a shoe is slowly becoming a shoe. Sole tacked, upper drawn tight, the whole thing held together for now by nothing more than pressure and a promise. The cobbler works without hurrying. He has made 10,000 shoes in this room, or near enough, and every one of them has taught him something about the 11,000th. You could walk the length of the town on a working morning and read its whole economy off the open doorways alone. A lass maker here, a tanner's apprentice there, a boy of perhaps 10 years old running a bundle of finished uppers between 2 workshops because his legs were faster than anyone else's in the building. Nobody in Herzogenaurach thought of this as remarkable. It was simply what the town did, the way a fishing town fishes and a mill town mills. Herzogenaurach made shoes, and it had made them for so long that nobody living there any longer felt the need to explain it to anybody else. This was the world that Christoph and Pauline Dassler were raising a family inside. Christoph had not been born to the shoe trade at all. His people had been weavers and dyers for as far back as anyone in the family cared to count, part of that older Herzogenaurach, the cloth town, that was already fading by the time he was old enough to learn a trade. It was only the slow collapse of that old weaving trade, in his own working life, that pushed him toward the bench instead of the loom. He learned to stitch leather the way his father had learned to work a shuttle, out of necessity more than inclination at first, and found steady work at one of the town's shoe factories, where in time he came to specialize in a modest, unglamorous line. Felt slippers, the soft indoor kind sold by the dozen, unremarkable, dependable, the kind of thing a working household always needed one more pair of. Pauline, meanwhile, kept a small laundry business running from the house, on a lane the townspeople called Am Hürtengraben, taking and washing for neighbours who could not manage a full boil and mangle of their own, the way many wives in a small working town did, to keep the household afloat between one of Christoph's pay packets and the next. Steam and lye soap and wet linen hung to dry across the yard. That was the other trade the house ran on, quietly, alongside the leather. Between them, Christoph and Pauline had 4 children who lived to adulthood. Fritz came first, in 1892, then Marie in 1894, then Rudolf in 1898, and last on the 3rd of November, 1900, a boy they christened Adolf, and would call for the whole of his life simply Adi. Adi was not yet 14 when the war came, in the summer of 1914, and for its first years he was still a schoolboy in Herzogenaurach, watching older men from the town go east and west by train, and, in steadily increasing numbers, not come back. But wars have a way of reaching down for the young as they run short of the old. And in June of 1918, before he had even turned 18 years of age, Adi was called up himself. The fighting proper had only months left to run by then, though nobody in the summer of 1918 could have promised anyone that. He served through the armistice and on into the following year, and was not released from military service until October of 1919. He came home then to a Germany that bore almost no resemblance to the one he had left. The war was lost, the old empire was gone, replaced by a fragile republic nobody entirely trusted yet. Men who had once been factory hands or shopkeepers stood on street corners in threadbare uniforms with nothing to go back to. Money was already beginning the long slide that would end, within a few more years, in wheelbarrows of banknotes traded for a loaf of bread. Leather, rubber, and steel, the raw materials of an ordinary shoemaker's ordinary week, were desperately scarce, tangled up in a defeated country's broken supply lines. Even a town built entirely on the shoe trade could not simply carry on as before, when there was no reliable leather to be had at any price a working family could meet. It was not on the face of it a sensible moment for a 20-year-old with no capital to start a business making shoes. Adi did what he could to get by. He mended shoes for his neighbours, the way any trained cobbler's son might, taking in whatever work came through the door. But he had come home from the war with an idea he could not quite put down. The story goes that the shoes people wore for sport, for running, for football, for gymnastics, all of it still fairly new to ordinary working families in 1920, were badly made, heavy, stiff, built the same whether a man was walking to church or trying to run a race. Adi thought a shoe built specifically for what the body was about to do could be built better, and since there was no factory that would let him test the idea and no money to build one of his own, he did the only thing available to him. He went home to his mother's washroom. Picture the room as it must have looked to Pauline the first time her son moved his tools into it. A wash kitchen is not built for shoemaking. It is built for steam and scrubbing boards, and the particular damp warmth of boiled linen. The tubs were still there, most likely, pushed back against one wall to make room. A single window let in what light there was, and on a grey Franconian morning, that was not very much light at all. The smell of the room would have taken longer to change than the furniture in it. Lye soap and wet cloth giving way, slowly, over months, to leather and glue and machine oil, until the two smells simply lived there together, one trade laid quietly over the other. And into this unlikely space, sometime around 1920, Adi Dassler carried a last, an awl, a hammer, and whatever leather he had been able to find or improvise, and set about trying to make a shoe that did not yet properly exist. He was not entirely alone in it. An older, more experienced shoemaker in the town, a man named Karl Zeck, worked alongside him in those first months, lending a trained hand to Adi's still-forming ideas. And because there was no reliable source of proper leather in a defeated country, with its factories idle and its ports slow to open again, the two of them scavenged. Army debris, left scattered across a countryside that had spent 4 years arming and rearming its young men, became, in Adi's hands, the raw material of peacetime sport. Old army helmets and canvas bread pouches were cut down and reworked into soles. Silk salvaged from discarded parachutes, so the story is told in the town to this day, was turned into the lining of soft training slippers. There was, in those years, simply no other way to begin. Even the machinery was improvised. Germany's electrical supply, in the chaos after the war, could not be relied on from 1 hour to the next, and a small wash kitchen workshop on Am Herzogenaurach was never going to be first in line for it in any case. So Adi rigged a leather milling machine to the frame of a bicycle, mounted upside down on a pair of wooden beams, and connected the whole arrangement by a system of belts. His first employee, a young man named Josef Erhardt, spent long hours simply pedaling, turning the machine that split and prepared the leather, going nowhere at all, while behind him Adi worked the material the pedaling produced. It must have made an odd sound from the lane outside. A bicycle bell that never rang, going at a fixed and steady pace, hour after hour, in a room that had been built for washing sheets. There is something almost too neat about that image, and it is worth pausing on it for exactly that reason. A grown man pedaling a bicycle bolted to a beam, going nowhere, so that a leather mill could turn. It sounds, told badly, like a fable invented afterwards to make the founding of a great company feel humble and quaint. But it was not invented. It was simply what a defeated country in 1920 could offer two young men who wanted to make something and had almost nothing to make it with. Necessity built that bicycle mill, not charm. The charm only arrived later, in the telling. What comes through in nearly every account of Adi in those years is a particular kind of temperament. He was quiet. He was not, by most descriptions, an easy man to draw into conversation about anything other than the thing in front of him. But put a half-finished shoe in his hands, or an athlete's complaint about how a spike sat under the ball of the foot, and something in him opened up. He listened carefully to complaints that another man might have shrugged off as fussiness. A strap that rubbed, a sole that flexed in the wrong place, a heel that slipped by a fraction of an inch on the turn. Developing a shoe, his own family would later say, was never really his job to him. It was closer to a private obsession he happened to have found a way to be paid for. He experimented for its own sake, tried materials other cobblers in the town would never have thought to reach for, and kept it a problem long after most men would have called the shoe good enough. His brother Rudolf was cut from a different cloth entirely, and everyone in Herzogenaurach who knew the pair of them said so. 2 years Adi's senior, Rudolf had a restlessness in him that a wash kitchen workshop alone could never satisfy. Where Adi turned inward over a workbench, content to lose an entire evening to the angle of a single stitch, Rudolf turned outward, into rooms, toward people. He had the kind of easy warmth that made strangers feel, within a few minutes, that they had known him for years. The gift, in other words, of a natural salesman, in a family that had never before produced one. He liked a crowded room. He liked an argument, so long as he could win it pleasantly. He was, by every account that survives him, the sort of man who was remembered long after he had left a conversation for reasons he had made look effortless. Adi built the shoe. Rudolf, everyone already sensed, would one day be the one to walk it out the door and put it in front of the world. It was not yet a business in those first wash kitchen years, barely even a workshop by most ordinary standards. But it already had, without anyone quite arranging it, the shape of a partnership waiting to happen. One quiet brother bent over a lass by lamplight, one restless brother already looking toward the road out of town, and a river between the two temperaments that, for now, was nothing more than a river. Neither brother, that year, could have told you where it would lead. There was no factory yet, no name over a door, no register in any town hall with the Dassler name attached to a company. There was a converted washroom, a scavenged leather mill turned by a bicycle that would never go anywhere, and a young man who had come home from a war too young to have chosen it, and decided quietly that he would spend his life on the problem of a better shoe. It began, in other words, exactly where the story of most enormous things begins. Small, improvised, almost invisible, even to the people living through it. A mother's laundry room, a length of belting, and two brothers who did not yet know how far apart their gifts would eventually carry them. We left Adi in his mother's wash kitchen, with his lasts and his leather and his machines that ran on borrowed motion. He had the hands, he had the patience. What he did not have was a voice. His brother Rudolf had one. Rudolf Dassler was the older of the two by 2 years. Broad where Adi was slight, loud where Adi was quiet, quick where Adi was deliberate. He had come home from the war like everyone else, and tried on other trades the way you try on coats. A spell in a porcelain works, a spell in the leather trade in Munich, even training for the police. None of it fitted. And in 1923, or early the following year, the family records allow a little slack. Rudolf came back to Herzogenaurach, to the smell of leather and lime-washed walls, and joined his younger brother's business. It is worth resting a moment on how well matched they were in the beginning, because everything that happens later happens because of it. Adi could make a shoe lighter than anyone in Bavaria thought a shoe could be. He could look at a runner's foot the way a saddler looks at a horse, and see where the weight went and where it was wasted. But he would rather spend an evening filing a spike plate than talking to a customer. Rudolf was the opposite. Rudolf could sell. He could walk into a sports club in Nuremberg with a sample bag and come out with an order and 3 new friends. He believed in the shoes because he believed in his brother, and he said so, loudly, in rooms Adi would never have entered. One brother made the thing, the other carried it out into the world. For a while, for a good long while, that was enough. In the summer of 1924, the partnership was given its proper name. The brothers walked their papers into the registry, and the firm was entered in the commercial rolls as the Dassler Brothers Sports Shoe Factory. Gebrüder Dassler, the letterhead said. Brothers Dassler, nothing more. Herzogenaurach had carried shoemakers' names on its ledgers for 300 years. It is doubtful anyone in the registry office looked twice. Picture the workshop in those first registered years, because it is a good place to be drowsy in. A dozen workers, more or less. Benches under the windows for the light. The treadle machines going with a sound like slow rain. 50 pairs of shoes a day came off those benches, on a good day. Each one touched by hands at every stage, because there was no other way to make them. And what shoes they were beginning to be. Not the heavy boots of the town's tradition, but running shoes with forged metal spikes, light as gloves, and football boots with leather studs built for mud and for speed. Adi tested everything himself. He ran in the shoes on the field by the river. He played football in them, badly and happily, on Sunday afternoons. When a seam failed, he wanted to know why it failed, and the next week's seam was different. Stand at one of those benches for a while, if you like. There is nowhere better to grow drowsy. You are holding a last in your left hand, a wooden foot smooth as a banister worn by a century of palms, and over it you are easing a piece of leather so thin you can feel the warmth of your own fingers through it. The workshop smells of hide and wax and machine oil, and faintly, underneath, of coffee gone cold on a windowsill. Down the bench a treadle machine murmurs, and beyond it someone is skiving an edge, shaving off curls of leather finer than paper, each one falling without a sound. There is a rhythm to it that asks nothing of you. Stretch and tack and stitch. Stretch and tack and stitch. The same 3 motions the town has made for 300 years, only bent now towards something new. And at the end of the room, at a bench like yours, the younger brother is doing the thing he will do all his life. He has a spike plate in a small vise, and a file in his hand, and he is taking metal off it, stroke by stroke, weighing it in his palm between strokes, the way a jeweller weighs a stone. A gram here, half a gram there. he has learned something that sounds simple and is not, that a runner lifts each shoe many hundreds of times in a race, and that every needless gram is lifted every single time. So he files, and weighs, and files, while the light moves slowly across the benches, and the treadles murmur, and the afternoon goes wherever afternoons go. Nobody hurries him. Hurrying him had been tried and had failed, and the trying had been given up, which is perhaps the kindest thing a family firm ever does for its perfectionist. Word of this sort of care travels slowly, but it travels. It reached in time a man named Joseph Weitzer, the coach of the German athletics team, a man who spent his life around runners' feet. Weitzer came to Herzogenaurach, expecting perhaps a workshop of country cobblers, and found instead a young man who asked him questions nobody had ever asked. How a sprinter's foot lands, where a distance runner blisters, what a shoe could weigh if you took away everything that was not needed. The two became collaborators, and then friends. And through Weitzer, the shoes from the little factory on the Aurach began to find their way onto the feet of the fastest people in Germany. The brothers were still in their 20s. The firm was younger than that, and already the thing had a shape it would keep for decades. Adi in the workshop, asking his quiet questions. Rudolf on the road with the order book filling, and between them a river town making shoes, as it always had, only lighter now and faster. Then, in 1928, the Olympic Games came to Amsterdam, and with them, something new under the summer sky. For the first time in the modern games, women were to run the 800 meters, 2 laps of the track, against the clock and against a century of opinion that said they could not or should not. Among the runners was a German named Lena Radke. Small, precise, relentless, and on her feet the story is happily verifiable. Were spikes from Herzogenaurach, Dassler shoes carried to Amsterdam in a kit bag, laced up in the shadow of the stands. Think of the distance those shoes had come. Not the miles, which were nothing, but the rest of it. Cut and stitched at a bench by the Aurach, in a town most of the crowd in that stadium could not have found on a map. Weighed in a quiet man's palm, filed lighter, weighed again. Handed over with the shy insistence of a craftsman who knows exactly what he has made and cannot quite say so. Some 30,000 people or so filled the stands around that track in Amsterdam, right up to what the old stadium could hold. And not one of them was thinking about shoes, which is, when you consider it, the whole art of a running shoe, to be forgotten utterly at the very moment it matters most. She ran the 2 laps of her life. She won, gold in a world record time, the first Olympic title over that distance any woman had ever held, and the first athletics gold her country had ever won. The race soon became the subject of a controversy that, looking back, nobody could ever quite justify. A worry, unfounded, that 800 meters was too strenuous a distance for a woman to run. And the event was quietly dropped from the program for more than 30 years, on no good evidence whatsoever. But the race itself could not be taken away. It had happened. It was in the books, and in the books, though hardly anyone knew to look, were the shoes. The first Olympic gold ever won in Dassler spikes. There would be others, so many others in time that the counting would lose its point. But the first one belonged to Lena Radke, on a cinder track in Amsterdam, and to a pair of shoes made by hand in a small town on a small river, by a man who was happier filing a spike plate than watching the race. When the news reached Herzogenaurach, the story goes, the workshop allowed itself one good evening, and then went back to work. There were orders now. There were always orders now. Through the end of the 20s, the business outgrew everything it touched. The wash kitchen was long behind them. The benches multiplied. The workers multiplied. And in time, the brothers took on a proper factory building near the railway station, where the goods trains could carry Herzogenaurach shoes out into the world without asking the road's permission. Athletes wrote letters, clubs sent measurements. In a country still bruised and uncertain, the little firm was becoming, quietly, a name. You could measure those years by the station platform, if you wanted a gentle way to measure them. At first, a few parcels a week, wrapped in brown paper and string, waiting for the afternoon train beside the milk churns. Then crates, then a handcart to bring the crates, then a morning delivery and an evening one. Boxes stenciled for Berlin, for Vienna, for towns the station master had to look up. The town watched it happen the way a town watches anything. Over fences and in the bakery queue, with one part pride and one part the older shoemaker's quiet reserve. The Dassler boys, people said, the washerwoman's sons, doing something new down by the station, and doing rather well at it by the look of the crates. Inside the family, the division of labour had settled into something like doctrine. Adi belonged to the benches and the testing field. Rudolf to the trains, the trade fairs, the hotel bars where orders were toasted and rivals were charmed. Even their father Christoph, the old shoemaker, worked at the firm his sons had built. The trade of the town folding back into itself, one generation stitched to the next. The brothers built their whole world around it and around each other. They worked in the same rooms, dined at the same tables, and in time they moved their families under a single roof, a villa by the factory, one household above the other, in the way of prosperous German families of the age. Adi married Keta, the daughter of a shoemaking family, clever and steady and devoted to the firm. Rudolf married Friedel. Children came. From the street, in the lamplight of an evening, it must have looked like the completest kind of success. One business, one house, one family rising together. Hold that picture gently, because the times were about to put their hand on it. In January of 1933, the National Socialists came to power in Germany, and on the 1st of May that year, both brothers joined the party. That is the plain fact, and it is best said plainly. Adolf Dassler and Rudolf Dassler became members of the National Socialist Party in the first spring of the regime, as hundreds of thousands did in exactly those months. Why, precisely, is not a thing either brother left behind him in his own words. Only the record of the card itself and what came after it. Adi went further than the card alone in time, lending himself to the regime's sporting organizations as well. Their letters, like most business letters of those years, carried the regime's greeting at the bottom. The firm supplied sports shoes to the state's youth organizations. How much either man believed, and how much he simply went along, is still argued over by historians. But neither man stood apart, and the record does not offer either of them a way to be remembered as having done so. The shoes stayed light, the order book stayed full, and the country around the little factory grew darker year by year, at first slowly and then not slowly at all. In 1936, the Olympic Games came to Berlin, staged by the regime as a pageant of itself, a festival meant to prove a poisonous idea in front of the whole world. And into the middle of that pageant came a 22-year-old American named Jesse Owens, the son of an Alabama sharecropper, the grandson of enslaved people, and, that summer, very simply the fastest man alive. Here the story turns into legend for a moment, so hold it the way you hold legends lightly. The story goes that Adi Dassler heard Owens was quartered in the Olympic Village and drove out to it himself, a suitcase of spikes in the back of the car, and that with no common language between them, the shoemaker knelt and offered, and the sprinter tried the shoes and liked them. Whether it happened just so, the drive, the suitcase, the kneeling, no one can now swear. What is certain is the leather. Photographs and the trade's own records agree that Jesse Owens ran in Dassler shoes that summer. Handmade spikes from Herzogenaurach, with 2 thin stripes of leather along the sides. And in those shoes, in the regime's own stadium, under the regime's own flags, Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals. the 100 meters, the 200 meters, the long jump, the relay. 4 times, the fastest man alive climbed the podium, and the pageant's poisonous idea stood refuted in front of 100,000 people by a black American in Bavarian shoes. The brothers had backed the greatest athlete of the age, and the world's sporting trade noticed. Before those games, the factory sold some 20,000 pairs of shoes in a year. Within a few years, it was 200,000, 10 times over, orders arriving from countries the brothers had never seen. By any measure a business could count, the Dasslers had arrived, and so, on the eve of everything. Stand outside the villa a moment in the blue of the evening, and look up at the lit windows. 1 house, 3 family floors, Adi and Katie on the ground floor, Rudolf and Friedel in the middle, the parents above. 2 brothers, 2 wives, 2 sets of children. 1 firm, 1 fortune, rising under 1 roof. It should have been the safest arrangement in the world. It was instead a slow experiment in proximity, and it was beginning, very quietly, to fail. The wives, the accounts agree, did not get on. Kata and Friedel shared a kitchen the way rival queens share a border, politely and not for long. Small grievances stored themselves up the way small grievances do in a shared house. Who said what on the stairs, whose children were favoured, whose husband did the real work of the firm. And beneath the domestic weather ran an older current between the brothers themselves. The maker and the seller, each privately certain the firm's success was mostly his own. It is an old argument, that one, and it has no answer. A shoe that no one sells feeds nobody. A salesman with nothing worth selling is only a voice. The truth, that the firm was the 2 of them together or it was nothing, was the one truth neither brother could quite afford to hold on to, because each had built his pride on his own half of it. In good years, such arguments sleep. The 20s and 30s had been good years. Order books full, medals won, the family name on boxes in a dozen countries. The argument slept, but it slept in the house with them, on the landing between the 2 floors, so to speak. And what the coming years would do, above all else, was wake it. None of it yet was beyond mending. Families have carried worse across whole lifetimes and come out whole. What this family needed was ordinary time. Slow years, dull years, years with nothing in them but shoes. What it got was September of 1939. The lights in the villa burn a little longer tonight. Let them burn. The brothers are still speaking. The factory whistle still calls 1 workforce to 1 gate in the morning. Hold the town there for a breath, whole and prosperous and asleep beside its river. It is the last unbroken evening we will spend here. War changes a factory the way frost changes a river. From the outside it looks much the same. The same walls, the same roof line against the same sky. But the current underneath is stopped. When the war began, the firm was ordered, like every firm, into the service of the state, and army boots and training shoes for soldiers took up more and more of every week's production. But sports shoes did not vanish from the benches all at once. The factory went on making them under military order for years yet, because for a long while the state still counted them worth having. The young men of the workforce went east and west in uniform, and their benches stood empty, and the shortages crept in, leather and rubber and thread all rationed, all begrudged. By the middle of the war the factory was short of hands altogether, and here the record must be allowed to say its sober piece. In 1942 the firm asked for, and was given, prisoners of war to work its lines, and forced labourers, at least 9 of them by the local historians counting, worked in the Dassler operations before the war was done. They had no choice in the matter. That fact belongs in this story, and it stays in it. Then, late in 1943, the authorities decided the shoemaking itself was no longer worth the war's while, and ordered it stopped. The machines that had stitched running shoes were hauled out, and other equipment was hauled in. And from November of that year, the firm worked as a subcontractor, supplying metal parts for an anti-tank weapon. The factory that had shot Olympians was now making pieces of war material. Nobody in the town was asked their opinion. Even the sound of the place changed. A shoe factory has a soft voice, treadles and tapping and the hiss of a polishing wheel. The war gave it a hard one. The crack and spit of welding, the ring of metal on metal bench, the smell of scorched flux where the smell of wax had been. Women who had spent 20 years sewing uppers with a saddler's patience now stood at welding stations in borrowed goggles, fitting together metal parts for a weapon they had never asked to understand. And the factory whistle went on calling the shifts morning and evening, as though nothing at all had changed except everything. The brothers, meanwhile, had begun their own war, smaller than the world's, and, for this story, more fatal. Adi had been called up first, in 1940. A man past 40, drilled for a few winter months, and then sent home, released back to the factory as the indispensable man, the one pair of hands the firm could not do without. Rudolf never quite believed that verdict was innocent. He was the older brother, and it was Adi the authorities had judged indispensable, Adi who slept at home while other men were posted away. The suspicion that his brother or his brother's wife had arranged it so settled into Rudolf like damp into a wall. There is no document that proves it. There was no document that could disprove it. It simply stayed there, and everything that happened afterwards, it coloured. And so we come down these stairs to the one moment everyone agrees on, and no one has ever untangled. It is 1943. The bombers come over Bavaria by night now, bound mostly for Nuremberg, a few miles off, whose glow can be seen from the rooftops on the worst nights. When the sirens begin their long climb over Herzogenaurach, the town does what all towns had learned to do. Lights out, coats on over nightclothes, children lifted half asleep. And the families of the villa go down into the shelter, into concrete and dim light, and the smell of damp stone, to sit out the drone of engines overhead, with their children on their laps. They had done it many times before that night. They would do it many times after. Fear, repeated often enough, becomes almost domestic, a routine of candle stubs and folded blankets, of counting the far-off thuds and pretending, for the children to be calm. It is in exactly such a room, on exactly such a night, that a family is least guarded about what it says, and least forgiving about what it hears. On the night in question, and it survives only as the family told it, each side differently for the rest of their days, Rudolf and Friedel and their boys were already below when Adi and Keta came down the steps. And as he came in under the low ceiling, with the sirens still going and the sound of the raid beginning far off, Adi said, aloud to no one in particular, "The dirty dogs are back again. Schweinehunde in the German, a word for curs for filthy hounds. He meant the bombers. He said so afterwards for the rest of his life. He was a man coming down into a hole in the ground while other men flew overhead to burn his country, and he cursed them. It is, on its face, the likeliest thing in the world." But Rudolf was sitting where the words landed, and Rudolf, primed by years of the villa's silences, by the suspicion about the call-up, by every stored grievance of a shared house, heard it otherwise. He heard his brother walk into a shelter, look at Rudolf's family sitting there, and call them the dirty ones, the swine, them. Nothing was said, the story goes. That is the terrible part. No shout, no blow, nothing a neighbour could have witnessed and later settled. Only a sentence, landing in the dark, between the sirens and the engines. Heard one way by the man who said it, and another way by the man it fell on. Adi may never, that night, have known anything had happened at all. There are wounds like that in most families. a word meant for the weather that strikes a person instead. Most of them heal because most of them are asked about. This one was never asked about. It went upstairs after the all clear, into the divided villa, and it stayed. After the shelter, the war itself came for Rudolf. In 1943 he was called up at last, posted away from Herzogenaurach, and eventually east to a small occupied town in Poland, far from anything he could influence. He was convinced, again without proof, again without any means of disproof, that his brother's hand was somewhere in the posting. His letters home turned bitter. In one of them, written to Adi, he promised that if the chance ever came, he would see the factory shut down entirely, so that his brother would finally be forced to put on a uniform and discover what it was to be sent away. A man does not write such a letter to a brother he expects to forgive. How willingly Rudolf served, and in what capacity, would be argued over by investigators for years afterwards. And this story will not pretend to settle what they could not. What is known is how his war ended. In the first days of 1945, the Soviet army came through the region where he was posted, and his unit was destroyed. But Rudolf was not with it. Weeks earlier, seeing what was coming, he had made his own way home to Herzogenaurach, where a sympathetic doctor certified him unfit for service on account of a frozen foot. The army called that sort of homecoming desertion. He did not stay free long. In the spring, days after the brothers had buried their father, Christoph, the old shoemaker gone in the war's last weeks, his sons standing at the same graveside in their black coats. Rudolf was arrested by the secret police and taken to their prison in Nuremberg. He sat in a Gestapo cell while the regime he had joined in 1933 spent its final month dying. And Rudolf would say, the rest of his life, that American troops freed him as the regime collapsed, though investigators were never quite satisfied with his account. And Rudolf, sitting in that cell, had done his arithmetic. Somebody had informed on him. He never learned who. He decided, and never afterwards undecided, that it was his brother. Peace, when it came to Herzogenaurach, came as a questionnaire. The Americans occupied the town, requisitioned what they needed, and set about the long sorting of who had been what in the 12 years just ended. Every adult filled in the forms. Every firm opened its books, and the Dassler brothers, party members both since the 1st of May, 1933, each stood before the process in turn, and each, when his moment came, spoke about the other. In the summer of 1945, Rudolf was arrested a second time. By the Americans now, on suspicion of having worked for the regime's security service in the East. He denied it. The investigators held him a full year in an internment camp at Hammelburg, and in the end proved nothing of the kind against him, and let him go. But among the papers that had helped put him there, Rudolf believed to his last day, were words from his own family. And the record shows that both his brother and his brother's circle did, when asked, tell the investigators what they suspected of Rudolf's war. Then it was Adi's turn. The panel that examined him weighed the party card, the youth organisation contracts, the armaments in the factory, and at first it graded him among the incriminated, a man who might lose the firm entirely. He appealed. Witnesses spoke of decencies done quietly in hard years, and among the papers on the other side of the scale was a declaration from Rudolf, newly released, stating that his brother had brought the weapons work into the factory himself, willingly for profit. Brother against brother now, in writing, before officials. Each man's freedom, and each man's factory, partly hostage to the other's memory. In the end, the panel judged Adi a follower. Mitläufer, the word was, one who went along. The mildest grade but one. He paid his fine. Early in 1947, he was given back the right to run his business, and the two brothers returned to the same factory, the same villa, the same table of accounts, having each, in the other's firm belief, tried to bury him. There was no shelter deep enough for that. For roughly another year they endured each other. Partners in law, strangers in fact, passing in the corridors of the firm their father had watched them build. The factory made what it could. The first peacetime shoes were stitched, the story goes, from scavenged stuff, canvas and tent cloth and rubber, from wrecked machines of war. And business, being business, began slowly to come back. But everyone in the building knew. The workers knew. The town knew. One firm cannot hold two men who will not speak. In 1948, it ended. The brothers agreed to divide everything. The machines, the materials, the buildings, the accounts. Every last item, down to the benches, negotiated between men who now dealt with each other only through intermediaries and lists. And then came the strangest morning in the firm's history, the one the town never forgot. The workforce was assembled, and the matter was put to them plainly. The firm was splitting in two. Each of them was free to choose. Stay with Adi or go with Rudolf. No one would be told. Every man and woman in that yard, stitchers, clickers, salesmen, clerks, stood for a moment with their whole working life balanced on a choice between two brothers. Stand among them for a moment, because you are among them in this story. You have worked at these benches, let us say, since before Amsterdam. Your hands know the last the way they know your own stair rail in the dark. The brothers standing before you are not names on shoeboxes. They are the men who hired you, whose father you knew, whose weddings the town turned out for. And you must choose one of them this morning in front of your neighbors, knowing the other will remember. There is no record of raised voices in that yard. There would not have been. This was a town that did things quietly, and it did the largest thing in its history the same way, in murmurs, one name at a time. They chose the way people choose, by trade and by temperament. The salesmen, most of them, went with Rudolf, the voice of the firm, the man of the road. The craftsmen and the technical people, nearly all of them stayed with Adi, the hands of the firm, the man of the bench. Roughly 2 workers in 3 stayed on Adi's side of the ledger. The rest packed their tools and followed Rudolf out of the gate, across the little river Aurach to an old factory building on the far bank. Across the river, it matters that it was across the river. Herzogenaurach is stitched to itself by its bridges, and from that year on, every crossing meant something. All that remained was the naming, and the naming has a gentleness to it that neither brother intended. Rudolf went first. He took the front halves of his own 2 names, Ru from Rudolf, Da from Dassler, and registered his new firm as Ruda. It lasted only months. Ruda, it turned out, was not a name that made anyone's pulse quicken. And Rudolf, the born salesman, knew a bad name when he finally heard one. Before the year was out, he had reached for something with teeth in it, a hunting cat, lean and quick. Puma. Adi, on his side of the river, played the same quiet game with his own name. Adi from Adolf. Das from Dassler. Adis he tried first, and then found it sat too near the name of a children's shoe firm already on the register. So he mended it the way he mended everything, with one small precise adjustment. A single letter slipped into the middle. Adidas. In August of 1949, the firm was formally registered under the new name, with 47 employees on its rolls, and on its shoes, 3 parallel stripes of leather, claimed that same year as the company's mark. 2 brothers, 1 surname, cut in half and shared out like everything else they had ever owned, and that on paper was all it was. 2 registrations in a Bavarian ledger, a year apart. But stand on the bridge tonight and you can see what it actually was. On that bank, Puma. On this bank, Adidas. One town cut down the middle by 30 feet of slow water. Every family, every football club, every pub and bakery and pew, sooner or later sorted onto one side or the other. The river that had turned the mill wheels and washed the leather for 300 years had become a border, and the two men who made it so would grow old within a short walk of each other, and by most accounts never publicly make their peace, though the town itself tells quietly of one last meeting in Nuremberg, some months before the elder brother died, that neither man ever spoke of again. No one shouted. That is the thing to carry with you, as this part of the story lets you go. The great split of Herzogenaurach happened quietly, in ledgers and registry offices and a shelter under the ground. In one sentence heard two ways. The lamps along the riverbank burn low now. The water goes on under the bridge, unhurried, the way it went before the brothers, and the way it goes tonight. Dark and patient and perfectly indifferent to shoes. Let it carry the whole quarrel away for a while, downstream into the dark, and sleep. Every chapter of this story until now has stood in one square of ground. The town on the Aurach, the workshop, the villa, the shelter dug into a garden. This chapter begins somewhere else. A country of lakes and pine and long winter dark, 1,000 kilometers north of Herzogenaurach, where a different family had been making shoes for longer than either Dassler brother had been alive. Because this is not a chapter about a feud. Not directly. It is a chapter about two objects, a stripe and a stud. Small things stitched onto leather that outlasted every argument that ever surrounded them. Objects have a way of doing that. They do not take sides. They simply sit in a case, long after the people who fought over them have gone quiet, and let you look at them for as long as you like. We begin with the stripe. In Helsinki, in 1916, a sporting goods firm was founded under a plain, forgettable name. Yes, a few years later it renamed itself for an animal that suited it better. Karhu, the Finnish word for bear. Picture the workshop as it might have been in those early years. Low windows thick with frost on the inside as well as the outside. A stove ticking in the corner. Leather laid out on long benches to soften before the cutting began. A bear stamped into the sole of every shoe that left the building. Small and plain, the way a good mark should be. By the 1920s, Karhu's runners were among the most decorated on earth. Finland, in that decade, produced distance runners the way some countries produce grain. Steadily, abundantly, almost without explanation. The great Paavo Nurmi carried the bear's mark to Olympic gold in Paris in 1924. One gold among many that would follow him around the world, and the firm's racing spikes, the story goes, had worn a version of 3 pale stripes across the instep since somewhere in that stretch of years. Long before a young shoemaker in Bavaria began stitching stripes of his own onto the sides of his spikes, for reasons that had nothing to do with branding at all. Adi Dassler's stripes began as something almost incidental. Bands of leather stitched across the upper of the shoe to hold the foot steady through the heel and over the arch. Reinforcement and nothing more. But a mark repeated often enough becomes a signature whether or not anyone planned it so. And by the years after the war, the stripes were how a customer knew, at a single glance across a shop counter, whose shoe he was holding. Adi had taken, in his own quiet way, to calling his firm the Three-Striped Company. The trouble was, he did not own the stripes, not on paper, not in law. A firm in Helsinki had been there first, by decades, with a bear on its label and 3 stripes of its own already stitched into the leather. For a while this simply did not matter. 2 small firms in 2 small countries, each stitching stripes onto spikes for its own local runners. Oh, there was no quarrel in it, because there was no crossing of paths. A shopkeeper in Munich sold one firm's spikes. A shopkeeper in Turku sold the others. Neither man had any cause to think about the other at all. But Adidas was growing, and growing quickly, out past its own borders, and into markets that had never heard of Herzogenaurach. A mark that meant one thing in a Bavarian sports shop could not be allowed to mean something else, or nothing at all, on a shelf in Stockholm or London or Buenos Aires. Export catalogues were being printed. Crates of spikes were going out by rail and by ship to places that had, until recently, never seen a German football boot at all. And somewhere in among all that growth, sooner or later, somebody's lawyer was going to notice that two firms, an ocean apart in temperament, if not in distance, were quietly selling the same picture. So, in the early 1950s, 1951 in most tellings, though a few place it a year later, and nobody troubled to write the date down as carefully as we might wish, representatives of the two firms sat down across a table and settled the matter between them, the way small firms settled things before there were armies of lawyers to do it for them. Picture the room, if you like, though nobody recorded it closely enough for you to picture it exactly. A modest office, perhaps, or a hotel dining room after the other guests had gone to bed. Papers spread on a cloth still faintly ringed from earlier meals. Two men who understood shoes far better than they understood contracts, doing their best with both. There would have been the ordinary business of any such meeting. Numbers proposed and numbers reconsidered. A pause while someone fetched a second opinion. The scratch of a pen finally moving across a page that had waited all evening to be signed. And somewhere in the middle of it, whether as a courtesy or a peace offering, or simply because it happened to be on hand, somebody set two bottles of something warming on the table between the figures still being argued over. What Carhu asked and what Adidas paid is one of the strangest sums in the whole history of a brand. 2 bottles of whiskey, and a cash sum that would be reckoned today at somewhere around 1,600 euros. 2 bottles of whiskey. That is what the 3 stripes cost. It is worth being honest here about how much of that sentence can actually be trusted. Carhu's own historians, asked directly, will say plainly that no receipt survives for the whiskey. Nobody wrote down the brand, or the year, or which pair of hands carried the bottles across, or whether the 2 men drank a glass of it together before they parted, which is the detail this listener would most like to know, and the one detail nobody thought to preserve. The figure, the 1,600 euros, is itself a modern reckoning of an old and vanished sum, translated forward through decades of currency that no longer exists. Marks became something else, and that something else became something else again, and a figure that was once written down in a currency nobody uses anymore has had to be guessed at, gently, ever since. What is certain is only the shape of the story, a small useful mark, sold cheaply by people who had no way of knowing what it was about to become. The family in Helsinki tells the tale anyway, plainly, as the story goes, because it is very probably close enough to the truth, and because some prices are worth remembering exactly for how small they were. A company does not usually choose to keep alive a story about the bargain it lost. Carhu keeps this one anyway, told with something closer to good humour than regret, the way a family keeps the story of the year they nearly bought the house on the good side of the street, and didn't. Carhu, for its part, did not suffer for the sale. That same Olympic season, in Helsinki in 1952, its own runners raced in the nation's own spikes, on the nation's own soil, in front of the nation's own crowds. And they won again and again, 15 goals by one old tally, still wearing 3 stripes across the instep as always, the success that had made the mark worth buying in the first place. It was some years later, in 1960, that the bear finally chose a plain letter for its shoes instead. An M for mistari, the Finnish word for champion, stitched where the stripes used to be, as if the firm had simply turned the page and begun again. Adidas, meanwhile, now owned outright the mark it had been wearing all along without quite owning it, and could carry it, without a single further argument, onto shelves in any city on earth. The stripes went on, in the decades that followed, to become one of sport's most valuable and recognizable trademarks. The whiskey, wherever it ended up, has long since been drunk by somebody on some ordinary evening that nobody thought worth writing down either. The stripes were the signature, but the object they were stitched to, the boot itself, is where Adi Dassler's whole nature showed most clearly. He was a man who could not leave a shoe alone. Every sole, every stitch, every strip of leather was, to him, a question still being answered, and he tested his answers on real feet, on real ground, in real weather, over and over, long after most shoemakers would have called a design finished. Picture him, for a moment, the way the old workers describe him. A man crouched at the edge of a training pitch on a cold morning, watching a runner's stride rather than the runner's face, kneeling in wet grass to feel, with his own fingers, how much a sole was flexing under a foot mid-stride. He kept notebooks. He kept opinions on which leather held its shape in rain, and which went soft and useless within an hour. He had, the story goes, tried leather soles and rubber and cork, and combinations of all three, on athletes who had learned simply to hand him back the shoe after a race and wait, without complaint, for whatever came next. A boot, to this man, was never really finished. It was only resting between one improvement and the next. One question in particular occupied him for years. A football boot of that era carried studs that were simply nailed in place. Good for dry ground, useless for anything else. Change the weather, and the boot that had gripped like a hand on a rope in September might slide like a bar of soap by November. The answer he kept circling back to was studs that could be changed themselves, screwed in and out, swapped for longer ones, or shorter, or none at all, to suit whatever ground a match happened to be played on that day. It is worth pausing to say, honestly, that this was not Adi Dassler's own idea, whatever the later story liked to claim. A shoemaker named Alexander Salot had patented a boot with replaceable metal studs in 1949. A light thing, by the standard of the day, some 350 grams a boot, a good 100 grams less than a player was used to carrying on each foot. And, this being the kind of story it is, patents older still existed, filed by other hands as far back as the 1920s and the years just after. Across the river, Rudolph's firm insisted for years that it had been selling interchangeable studs to leading footballers since 1952, 2 full years before its brother's boot ever saw a stadium in Switzerland, and that its own players had worn them to a national championship that same season, with most of a winning team turned out in Rudolph's screw studs before Adi's name had come anywhere near a football pitch. It is one of the smaller ironies of this whole feud that even the studs became a quarrel. 2 brothers on 2 banks of one river, each certain the idea had been taken from him, when in truth a stranger held the older patent all along, and neither Dassler had thought of it first. What Adi did do, without any doubt, was put the idea to work at exactly the right moment, in front of exactly the right audience. He had made himself useful to the national team's manager, a careful, methodical man named Sepp Herberger, supplying boots and advice, and increasingly, a kind of quiet technical partnership that no rival firm could match. Herberger valued exactly the qualities Adi had spent a lifetime cultivating: patience, precision, and unwillingness to call anything finished until it had been tested past the point most men would have stopped. By the early 1950s, Adidas was the team's outfitter, in fact, if not always in name, and Adi had refined his screw stud system into something light enough and reliable enough to trust to a football team on the biggest afternoon of its life. That afternoon came on the 4th of July, 1954, at the Wankdorf Stadium in Bern. The Germans of that era had a private name, half fond and half superstitious, for the kind of weather that suited their captain, Fritz Walter, best of all. Fritz Walter Wetter, they called it, Fritz Walter Weather. The cold, grey, sodden sort of afternoon that sapped other men's legs, and seemed somehow never to sap his. Bern, on the day of the final, obliged him completely. West Germany had reached the World Cup final against Hungary. The great Hungarian side of that era, sometimes called the Golden Team, unbeaten in international football for 4 years, and only weeks earlier had beaten this same German side by 8-3 in an earlier round of the same tournament. Nobody in Bern that afternoon expected the result to be close. Newspapermen from a dozen countries had already, more or less, written their reports before the match had kicked off. And then it began to rain. It rained before kickoff, and it rained through the match, until the Wangdorf pitch was a shallow lake of mud, the white lines blurring at their edges, the corner flags hanging heavy and sodden against their poles. Hungary took an early lead. 2 goals inside the first 10 minutes, quick and clean, exactly as everyone had feared. And for a little while the match looked as one-sided as the form book had promised. Umbrellas closed over the wet seating. Coats were pulled tighter. Somewhere in the stands, a crowd that had come expecting a formality began, instead, to lean forward. But West Germany drew level before 20 minutes had been played, goal for goal, unhurried and stubborn. And the game settled into something harder and slower and wetter than either side had trained for. Boots sinking a little further into the turf with every passing minute, players slowing not from tiredness alone, but from the sheer clinging weight of the ground itself. At half-time, with the rain still falling and the ground still worsening, the German bench made its change. Boots came off the bench in a row, and studs were unscrewed and longer ones turned in place of the ones the players had started the match wearing. A few minutes' work with a spanner, done quietly, out of the worst of the weather, hands moving fast in the cold. When the players went back out, their boots bit into the mud in a way the Hungarians' boots, still carrying the shorter, fixed studs they had begun the match in, no longer quite managed. Dirt clung to the Hungarian soles, until the boots themselves seemed to grow heavier with every stride, a slow accumulating weight that had nothing to do with fitness and everything to do with footwear. The German boots, by contrast, came up clean, stride after stride, gripping where the others slid. Whether those few minutes with a spanner truly decided the match is a question football historians still enjoy arguing over on quieter nights than this one. The truer deciding factors were very likely fatigue and rain, and a Hungarian captain, Ferenc Puskás, playing through an injury he should not have been playing through at all, carried into the final on reputation and stubbornness, rather than a fully sound ankle. But the story that German crowds carried home that evening did not linger on fatigue, or fitness, or an injured captain. It settled gratefully on the boots. West Germany won in the end by 3-2. The victory soon became known, and has stayed known ever since, as Das Wunder von Bern, the miracle of Bern, and the name has never once been replaced by a plainer one in 70 years of retelling. It is worth sitting with what that miracle actually meant at the time to the people it happened to. 1954 was only 6 years on from a ruined currency and a ruined country. A nation still rebuilding its cities stone by stone, still uncertain in those years of what it was even permitted to feel proud of. Radios across the country had carried the match as it happened, and in towns very like Herzogenaurach, families who could not afford the journey to Switzerland gathered instead around a single wireless set in a front room, or a shop front, or a crowded inn, listening to a commentator's voice rise and fall with the rain 1,000 kilometers away. A football match is only a football match, but for one wet afternoon in Switzerland, a country that had spent almost a decade being told, quite rightly, to be quiet about itself, found something it could stand up and shout about instead. And the boots that had gripped the mud when the favourites' boots had not became part of how the whole evening was remembered. Men who had lived through the worst of the previous 10 years wept openly in front rooms and inns and shop fronts over a game of football, because for once the thing being celebrated cost nobody anything, and took nothing from anybody else, and simply felt, after so long, like permission. Somewhere today, behind glass, in quiet cases in museums built for exactly this purpose, boots of that same period still rest. Screw studs long since stilled. Leather gone the colour of strong tea. Laces tied the way somebody tied them 70 years ago and never has to tie again. No particular pair can be sworn to as the very one that gripped the Wankdorf mud that afternoon, and this story will not claim it, but boots enough like them survive that you may picture one easily, and not be far wrong. The mud of that afternoon is long since washed away, or worn into the leather so deep it has simply become part of the colour. Nobody wears them now. They are past wearing, the way the harp in another city's story was past playing. And they do not need to be worn. They only need to stand there, being what they are. A stripe bought for 2 bottles of whiskey, and a stud bought from nobody knows quite whom, joined together on one wet afternoon into the shape of a whole nation's relief. 2 brothers made this, between them, without ever quite meaning to. 2 brothers by then, who could not sit in the same room, whose names were already fixed on opposite sides of a river and a ledger and a lifetime's silence. And the shoe between them, quietly, kept on getting better. Whichever side of the river it happened to be stitched on, whichever brother's hands had shaped that particular sole, whichever bench and whichever workshop had sent it out into the rain. Come back now to Herzogenaurach, to the small Bavarian town where all of this began, and where, whatever happened in Helsinki or in Bern, most of the story was actually lived. From a little distance it looked like any other town of its size. A church tower, its bell marking the hours the way it had for centuries, indifferent to whichever side of the river was listening. A market square, cobbled and uneven, where farmers still set up stalls on the appointed mornings, selling vegetables and eggs and flowers to Dassler and Puma alike, because cabbages, at least, had never chosen a side. Half-timbered houses leaning gently toward each other over narrow streets, the way old houses do, their small gardens thick with the same roses, their chimneys breathing the same wood smoke into the same grey sky. A river running through the middle of it, modest enough that a child could throw a stone across in places. The Aurach, which had given the town its second name, Herzogenaurach. Herzo, the locals say when they are not standing on ceremony, and which now, since the split, gave it something else as well. A border. Not a fence, not a wall, nothing you could point to on a map and call official. Only a line of water, and on either side of it, a factory, a family, and a way of living that the other side did not share. And so, for the better part of 30 years, Herzogenaurach earned itself a nickname. People here did not say hello to a stranger by looking at his face first. They looked at his shoes. Picture it, if you like, though there is no need to picture it clearly. 2 townspeople meet on a corner. Old neighbours, perhaps, who have known each other for years, whose mothers knew each other, whose fathers worked the same shift at the same bench before the split ever came between them. Before a word is exchanged, each pair of eyes drops briefly to the other's feet. 3 stripes, or a leaping cat. The answer arrives in less than a second, and it decides, more than either of them might have liked to admit, how warm the greeting that follows will be. A little more warmth for a shoe from the same side of the river, a little less for the other, nothing so rude as a turned back, only a fractional cooling felt rather than seen. The butcher glanced down before he weighed your order. The milkman noted it, without quite meaning to, as he set the bottles on the step. Do this often enough, for long enough, every morning, every errand, every chance meeting on every corner, for the better part of 30 years. And a whole town starts walking with its head tilted forward and down, which is, the story goes, exactly where the name came from. The town of bent necks. It was not cruelty most of the time. It was custom, worn smooth by repetition, the way a path across a field gets worn smooth by feet that never meant to make a path at all. The two firms employed, between them, a very large share of everyone who worked in Herzogenaurach at all. So the choice of shoe was rarely really a choice. It was a birthright passed down a family, along with a house and a church pew, and a bench at a particular pub. A boy born to a stitcher at one factory grew up assuming, the way a boy assumes the colour of his own front door, that he would one day stitch there too, and wear that factory's shoe, and glance down at other men's feet the same way his father had glanced down at his. Because there were, of course, two sets of everything. Two factories facing each other across the same short stretch of water, close enough that a worker leaving one gate at the end of a shift could see quite plainly the lit windows of the other. Two sets of chimneys breathing the same smoke into the same evening sky. Two entrances, two car parks, two notice boards pinned with two sets of shift rotas, written in two sets of handwriting that nobody on the far bank would ever be asked to read. Adidas people came in time to be called, half in fondness and half in something sharper, the Dassler. Puma's people were the Pumeraner, and each kept, without needing to be told, to its own side of the street. There was a tavern for one and a tavern for the other, close enough that on a summer evening you could hear both sets of voices through both sets of open windows, and never once did the two crowds share a table. An Dassler drinking his evening beer in a Pumeraner tavern would have been noticed within minutes, remarked on for days, and never quite explained away. It simply was not done, in the same unspoken way that a person doesn't wear black to a wedding, or arrive at a funeral in bright colour. Within the factory walls themselves, staff on each side were discouraged from even naming the rival firm aloud. If the subject had to come up at all, it came up as a phrase, delivered flatly, the way you might mention the weather on the wrong side of a mountain. The competitor on the other side of the Orach. Even the town's bakeries learned to live inside the divide, and one of the oldest of them, 100 years old already by the time our story reaches it, found its own quiet way to serve both banks without giving offence to either. Its deliveries went out across the whole town every morning, Adidas doorsteps and Puma doorsteps alike, and the story goes that its driver kept both brands of shoe in the back of the car, changing right there behind the wheel, into whichever pair matched whichever street he was about to walk up. A small practical piece, worked out by a man who simply wanted his bread delivered without an argument. The rivalry found its truest, loudest stage on a football pitch, because of course it did. Herzogenaurach supported two clubs, not one. ASV wore Adidas on its badge and in its boot room, laced and studded and turned out, unsurprisingly, in whatever the factory across the way from Puma happened to be making that season. FC wore Puma's leaping cat stitched over the heart on every shirt, and its own boots, and its own particular shade of loyalty. When the two sides met, which they did most seasons, the whole town turned out along both touchlines, wrapped against the cold, flasks of coffee passed hand to hand, and for 90 minutes the argument that usually stayed folded quietly into a greeting on a street corner came out into the open, in full voice, under floodlights. Whistles blew, chants rose from one touchline and were answered from the other. Sons who had grown up kicking a ball together in the same schoolyard found themselves, on those Saturday afternoons, shouting for opposite ends of the same small pitch, cheering a foul against a boy they had shared a desk with only that same week, and walking home afterwards, more often than not, back to streets divided by the very same river the ball had just been kicked across. And the divide did not stop with grown men and football clubs. Children, the story goes, kept largely to their own side even at play. Separate corners of a shared schoolyard, separate loyalties absorbed before they were old enough to explain them. a habit learned so early that most of them could not have told you where it came from, only that it had always been there, the way the shape of the church tower had always been there. And when a young man from one bank began walking out with a young woman from the other, families on both sides are said to have looked twice, at least for a while, and asked more questions than they might have asked of a stranger from a different town altogether. "Where does the young man work?" an aunt might ask, in a voice pitched carefully neutral, already knowing the answer would matter more than it should. None of this was ever written into any rule. It did not need to be. It simply hung in the air of Herzogenaurach, the way the smell of leather and glue hung over both factories at once, indifferent to which side of the water it drifted from, settling equally over every rooftop, every washing line, every open window, on both banks alike. Even the ordinary rhythm of the working day came doubled. 2 hooters sounded across the rooftops each morning, minutes apart, calling 2 separate workforces to 2 separate gates. On 2 separate sides of a river, a child could still throw a stone across. Bicycles leaned in their hundreds against 2 sets of racks, bells still ringing faintly from the ride-in. 2 sets of lorries idled at 2 sets of loading bays, engines turning over in the cold, waiting to carry 2 rival names out onto the same roads, toward the same railway station, bound very often for the very same countries, sometimes on the very same ferry, in crates that never once acknowledged one another. 2 shift changes emptied onto 2 sets of streets at the very same hour of the evening, hundreds of bicycles wheeling home in 2 directions at once, past 2 different pubs, toward 2 different suppers, in houses that in every other way were identical. The same curtains drawn against the same dusk, the same smell of supper on the same kind of stove, the same tiredness settling into the same aching shoulders, on both banks of the river every single evening, for year after year after year. Seen from outside, it must have looked absurd. A war fought entirely in bakeries and beer gardens and the tilt of a stranger's chin. Seen from inside, for the people who lived it, it was not absurd at all. It was simply Tuesday. It was simply how a person in this town got dressed in the morning, and greeted a neighbour at noon, and came home in the evening to a street that had always been this way, for as long as anyone now living could remember it being any other way. The 2 brothers who had started all of this were, by now, old men who did not speak, living on opposite sides of a river in a town too small to let either of them forget the other was there. And their whole town had, without quite meaning to, arranged itself around that silence, had built, out of pubs and bakeries and football pitches and the angle of a stranger's neck, a kind of architecture for a quarrel that had begun once in a single air raid shelter, on a single frightened night, over words that may never even have been meant the way they were taken. The river went on running underneath it all, the way rivers do, indifferent to stripes and cats and hooters and whiskey bought cheap in Finland. It had watched this town when it was only a huddle of stone cottages around a mill, long before either brother was born, and it would go on watching long after the last of the bent necks had finally straightened. It had been there before either factory, and it would be there after both. And on quiet evenings, when the last whistle had blown and the last lorry had pulled away, and the 2 sides of the town had settled, at last, into the same soft dark, the bridge over the Aurach stood empty, lit by a single lamp, waiting, the way bridges do, for a foot that had not yet decided which way it meant to cross. Somewhere behind each bank's dark windows, a family slept under one roof or the other, dreaming, if they dreamed of the factory at all, only of leather and stitching, and the particular hum of a particular machine, never once dreaming that the water beneath that lamp was doing anything at all, except what water has always done, moving on, unhurried, toward morning. Leave the shop fronts for a moment. Leave the football pitches and the arguments about studs and stripes, and come down to the thing the whole argument was always about, underneath everything else. Not two names, not two men, and not even a river. Shoes. Actual shoes made by actual hands in two long brick buildings that faced each other across the water, like a pair of quiet, competing chapels. You are a stitcher at one of the two factories. It does not matter, for tonight, which one. The morning is the same on both banks. You wake before the light does. The room is cold, the way every room is cold at that hour in a Bavarian winter. And you dress quickly, by feel more than by sight, and you eat something small and warm before you go. Outside, the street is full of the same soft sound. It is full of every morning. Boots on cobbles, breath showing white, doors closing gently up and down the terrace as the town empties itself, house by house, toward the water. You know most of the faces you pass, the way you know the shape of your own hands. You do not know the faces on the other side of the river nearly so well, and there is a reason for that, quietly understood, that nobody troubles to explain anymore. The factory gate stands open by the time you reach it, lamplight spilling out across the wet stone. You hang your coat, take your card from its slot, and the day begins the way it always begins. Not with a bell exactly, though there is a bell, but with the low, steady murmur of 100 people arriving at once and finding, without hurrying, their own particular place in a large and familiar room. You did not choose this trade so much as inherit it, the way you inherited the shape of your father's hands, or the particular way your mother hums when she is concentrating. Somebody older stood behind you once, in your first weeks on this floor, close enough to correct the way your hands guided the leather under the needle, and the way your foot found the treadle without needing to look down. A word here, a small adjustment there. Patience offered the way it is always offered in a trade that cannot be taught in a hurry. You watched 100 seams before you were trusted with one of your own, and you have never quite lost the habit of watching, even now, when it is you who is watched in turn by somebody younger, standing exactly where you once stood. Your morning begins, as every morning begins, in the smell of the place. Leather has its own weather, and you have long since stopped noticing it, the way a sailor stops noticing salt. Underneath it there is glue, warm and faintly sweet, and underneath that, wax and oil, and the particular dry smell of paper patterns that have been handled by 1,000 hands before yours. You breathe it in without thinking, the way you breathe in your own kitchen, and somewhere in that smell is the whole reason you're here. Before your section ever sees a hide, other hands have already chosen it. In the cutting room, a clicker runs a blade along a paper pattern laid flat against good leather, working around the natural marks of the animal the way a careful cook works around a bruise in good fruit, so that nothing strong is wasted and nothing weak is used where strength will be asked of it. He has done this so many thousand times that his hand seems to know the leather before the blade has touched it. The pieces come to you already shaped, already numbered, already waiting to become something. Your bench is close to a window, which you count as good fortune, because the light there is honest and does not lie to you about a stitch gone crooked. In front of you sits a last, the wooden form, shaped like a foot but not quite like any foot, smoothed by years of handling until it shines faintly along its curves. Every model the factory makes has its own last, kept on a long shelf with hundreds of others, each one a small silent portrait of a shoe that doesn't yet exist. Beside the last sits an awl too, not for the closing itself, not anymore, but for the smaller work no machine was ever built for, easing a stiff seam before it goes under the needle, opening a lace hole cleanly, marking a line for a stitch that has to be exact. You have owned this awl, or one very like it, for longer than you have owned almost anything else you use each day. It fits your palm the way an old coin fits a pocket. You do not remember learning to hold it correctly. You only remember, once, not being able to. The morning's real work is the closing, drawing the cut pieces of an upper together into something that will eventually hold a foot. You feed 2 pieces of leather, edge to edge, under the needle, your foot on the treadle in a rhythm your body no longer thinks about, guiding the seam with just enough pressure to keep it honest, the machine doing the stitching for you quicker than any hand alone could manage, and no less careful for it. Then the next seam and the next, each one as true as the one before it, so that the finished row looks less like something a machine has done, and more like something that simply grew that way, naturally, along the leather. There is a rhythm to it that settles into your shoulders after the first hour and doesn't leave until the light does. Guide, tread, guide, guide, tread, guide. The machine makes a small sound each time the needle finds the leather, a soft, steady clatter, and multiplied across a long room full of benches, it becomes something close to weather. A low, even hum, under which people can talk, if they want to, without ever raising their voices above it. You are paid in part by the piece. So many pfennigs for so many pairs completed and passed. And there was a time when that thought alone could make a young stitcher's hands clumsy with hurry. But hurry is the one thing this work punishes without mercy. A rushed stitch shows, a rushed seam fails on some stranger's foot, months later, on a road you will never see, and somehow the shoe finds its way back to be examined, and the mistake is known. So the hands that earn the most in the end are not the fastest hands. They are the calmest ones, the ones that have made their peace with the bench, and simply keep moving all day, without ever once seeming to hurry at all. On Friday evening, the week arrives at its point, in a small brown envelope, counted and passed along the bench by a foreman who knows every name in the room without needing to check a list. Inside it is your wage, and folded in with the wage is the piecework tally, a column of small figures that tells you, more honestly than any conversation could, exactly how your week went. You do not need to add it up. Your shoulders have already told you, somewhere around Wednesday, whether it was a good week or merely an ordinary one. You fold the envelope once, put it away without opening it further on the factory floor, the way everyone does, and carry it home unopened, past the pub you do not drink in, to the kitchen table where it will be opened properly, by lamplight, with the whole household looking on. By midday your finished uppers have travelled 2 benches down, to the lasting room, where a different set of hands takes over. There, the upper is drawn firmly over the last, pulled tight at the toe, tight at the heel, coaxed and worked with a small pair of pincers, until the soft leather begins to remember, for the rest of its life, the exact shape of the wooden form beneath it. Tacks go in at the edges, temporary and few, just enough to hold the shape while the sole is set. It is careful work, patient work, done standing, with the whole weight of a good shoe's future resting in the tension of that pull. Too loose, and the shoe will never sit properly on a foot. Too tight and the leather splits quietly and the whole piece is lost. You have watched a good laster work, and it looks almost like nothing at all. A slight lean, a small tug, a glance down the line of the shoe from heel to toe to check that nothing has drifted. But take that same last from an ordinary pair of hands, and the shoe that comes off it will never quite forgive the difference. It is one of the small truths of this trade that nobody outside it ever learns. A shoe is not made by a machine, whatever the machines are for. It is made by hands that have learned, over years, exactly how much a piece of leather is willing to give before it stops giving gracefully. Beyond the lasting room sits the sole room, which announces itself before you even reach the door. A warmer, thicker smell than leather, sharper at the back of the throat, rubber compound heated and pressed, and, for the sports models the factory is known for, studded underneath with small conical grips set in careful rings. The nailing machines there make a different sound entirely, a short decisive clap, rather than the long hiss of the closing benches, and the men who work them wear the smell of hot rubber home with them so faithfully that their own children can tell, blindfolded, which parent has just walked through the door. At noon, the whole floor pauses at once, the way a tide pauses, and you go down to the canteen with everyone else. There is soup, usually, and bread, and the long tables fill with the same faces you began the morning beside. The talk is ordinary: a daughter's cough, a football match on Sunday, whether the rain will hold off for the wash line. Nobody here talks about the other factory unless it is to laugh gently at some small thing. A rumour of a new soul, a joke about the size of somebody's new machine. The rivalry, at this hour, in this room, is mostly good-natured. It becomes something else only when the river is crossed, and there is one rule about the river that nobody has ever needed to write down. You do not drink in the other side's pub. It is not forbidden exactly. There is no notice pinned anywhere, no manager who would say a word if you did. It is simply understood, the way it is understood, that you do not wear the wrong football colours to the wrong end of the ground. Your factory has its own pub, its own particular corner of the town, its own quiet loyalty passed down from father to son, along with the trade itself, and to sit at the other side's bar of an evening would be to say something you almost certainly do not mean, and could not easily take back. So you do not. Nobody makes you. You simply don't. And on the rare evening, when a stranger to the town wanders into the wrong pub by mistake, ordering a beer, asking an innocent question, the room goes quiet in a particular way that teaches him everything he needs to know, gently, without a single unkind word spoken. The afternoon takes you, if your bench is fortunate, into the finishing room, where the last real transformation happens. Soles are trimmed flush with the upper, the raw edge shaved smooth with a blade held at exactly the right shallow angle, and then burnished, rubbed and rubbed again, with a heated iron and a cloth, until the cut edge stops looking like a scar and starts looking like a seam that was always meant to be there. You run your thumb along it when it is done, the way you always do, the way everyone on this floor does without noticing they are doing it, checking for a roughness that should not be there. Usually there is none. When there is, you go back and you do it again, and nobody minds the extra minute, because a minute spent now is an hour of complaints spared later, on some foot in some town you will never visit, by the time the light through the high windows has turned from white to gold, to the deep amber of a Bavarian evening. Your day's pears sit in a neat row on the shelf behind your bench, waiting to be counted and boxed and sent on to a world that will never know your name, or the particular turn of your wrist, or the small quiet pride you take in a seam that will not fail. The whistle sounds. Chairs scrape back, unhurried, all down the long room. Coats come off their hooks. Outside, the evening has already begun to settle over both banks of the Aurach at once. The same lamps coming on, in the same order they always come on. The same smoke rising from the same chimneys. The same river sliding along, indifferent to all of it, exactly as it slid along before there were two factories to divide, and will slide along, presumably, long after the reasons for the divide have been forgotten entirely. You walk home the way you walked in, past faces you know and faces you don't, past a factory gate on the far bank, where, at this very hour, another stitcher very like you is hanging up her own coat, closing her own day, in a room built exactly like yours, making exactly the shoes you have just spent your own day making, only better, she would say, if you asked her. You would say the same of yours. Neither of you is wrong to think so. That too is part of the craft. Your all will go home with you tonight, wrapped in its cloth, and it will sit on the same shelf it always sits on, waiting for morning. One day, if you are fortunate, it will pass to somebody younger than you, the way it perhaps passed to you from somebody older, and the hand that takes it up will not know your name either, only the shape your palm wore into the handle over all these quiet years. That is how a trade like this survives the people who practice it, not in any ledger, and not in any argument about stripes or leaping cats, but in a tool worn smooth and a stitch that does not fail, passed on, bench by bench, for as long as anyone troubles to remember how. The brothers who began this story were growing old now, on their two sides of the river, in the two villas that had once been one household. But a story like this doesn't stay the size of the people who started it. It grows into the next generation, the way a river grows as it takes in smaller streams. And by the middle of the 1950s, the feud belonged, in practice, to two younger men who had grown up on opposite banks without ever really choosing to. Adi's son was named Horst. Rudolf's son was named Armin. They were cousins, born only a few years apart, raised within walking distance of one another in a town too small to keep them properly apart as boys, and grown by the time this chapter opens into two of the shrewdest young businessmen in European sport, each one determined to prove, on a stage far larger than Herzogenaurach, that his father's name deserved to win. Horst was sent to France while barely into his 20s in 1960 to build his father's business a new foothold in Alsace, and he did it with a coolness that startled men twice his age. A small workshop grown, within a few short years, into the dominant sporting goods maker in the whole country. Armin, meanwhile, had been sent to manage his father's first foreign outpost, across the Austrian border in Salzburg, learning early what it took to sell a Bavarian shoe to a world that had never heard of Herzogenaurach and did not much care to. Both cousins, in other words, learned the same lesson at almost the same time, in different countries, under different fathers, that the argument between the two factories no longer had to stay confined to one small town on one small river. It could be taken quite deliberately to the whole world. And so, in the years that followed, it was. Horst in particular had a gift his father never claimed to have, a talent not for making a shoe, but for making the world of sport itself pay attention to whoever wore one. He moved easily among the men who ran football federations and Olympic committees, learning the private business of a sport most people only ever saw played on a pitch. And he came in time to be spoken of as something like the father of sports sponsorship itself, the man who first understood that a governing body could be courted and funded and made an ally in much the way a single player could. It was not a gentle kind of business, and it was not always a visible one, but it changed quietly and permanently what it meant to dress the feet of a champion. Somewhere in this widening of the argument, an older kind of currency in the game of football began quite suddenly to grow. Footballers had worn a company's name on their boots for years already, quietly, here and there. An English maker putting its boots on famous feet since the 1950s. What changed in this new decade was the scale of it. In 1970, an English firm is said to have paid the England and Everton player Alan Ball a sum of £2,000. A modest fee by any later measure, but a sign of how fast the numbers and the appetite were about to grow. Payment not for playing well, but for playing in the right boots while doing it. Both Herzogenaurach houses understood, faster than almost anyone else in the sport, what this new currency meant. If a firm's three stripes, or a firm's leaping cat, could be seen on the feet of the world's best players, in front of the world's largest audiences, then a boot was no longer simply a boot. It was a moving advertisement that also happened to win football matches, and there was no obvious ceiling to what a company might reasonably pay to control it. Both sides began signing players and clubs and eventually entire national federations with a speed that would have astonished the two brothers who had once fought over spikes and stitching in a shared factory attic. Whole rooms of the two head offices now existed for no other purpose than this quiet arithmetic. Which captain, which winger, which whole 11 of a national side might be persuaded, for a fee agreed quietly and never printed on any invoice, to wear one set of stitching rather than another when the cameras of the world were watching. It was, in its way, still the family trade, It was still underneath the contracts and the travel and the sums involved, one cousin trying to outfit the other. Only the workshop had grown to the size of the whole game. But there was one name so large that both cousins, for once, hesitated. Pelé. By the end of the 1960s, he was, by common agreement, the finest footballer alive. Twice already a champion of the world, and a single endorsement from him was worth more than either firm's entire advertising budget besides. The story goes that the cousins had first found a kind of wary respect for one another, years earlier, at the Melbourne Olympic Games in 1956. Two young men sent by their fathers to manage rival stands under the same roof, discovering, perhaps to their own surprise, that they had rather more in common with one another than either had with the older feud they had inherited. It is said they talked late into more than one evening that fortnight. Two cousins who had grown up within sight of each other's chimneys without ever really being allowed to be friends. Whatever passed between them there, by the approach of the 1970 World Cup in Mexico, the two houses had reached an understanding, never written down and never spoken of outside the smallest circle of each firm, that a bidding war for Pelé himself would ruin them both for the sake of a single man's boots. Neither would sign him. It became known, in the years afterward, simply as the Pelé Pact. The one piece of the old family piece the cousins ever quite managed to build, and, as it turned out, the only piece that would not last. It did not survive the tournament it was meant to protect. Quietly, and without the knowledge of the men in Herzogenaurach, who thought the matter settled, a Puma representative approached Pelé's circle before the finals began, with an offer the Pact was never supposed to allow. The exact figure has been told various ways over the years, but the arrangement most often described was $25,000 for the tournament itself, with a further $100,000 promised over the following 4 years, and a small share of boot sales besides. A package built for the whole relationship, though everyone understood which few seconds would matter most on the largest stage in the world. The moment came in the quarter-final against Peru under the high, thin sunshine of a Mexican afternoon, in a stadium already loud with the anticipation of kickoff. As the two sides gathered at the centre circle, Pelé is said to have asked the referee, a Belgian official by the name of Vital Laurent, for a short pause before play began, so that he might kneel and retie a lace that did not, by most accounts, actually need retying. It was a small request, the kind any referee grants without a second thought. But the cameras of the world were already trained on the most famous face in football, waiting for the whistle, and for those few seconds they had nowhere else in the whole stadium to look. A knee bent, a hand worked, unhurried at a lace. And on television sets across a great deal of the watching world, in a moment that lasted barely longer than it takes to describe, millions of people saw exactly what they were meant to see: a pair of boots and the name stitched quietly into the leather. And it was not the name that had built its factory in Herzogenaurach's north end. Brazil won that afternoon 4-2, and went on, as it happened, to win the whole tournament. But in the town on the Aurach, the football score barely registered. What registered was the betrayal of an agreement that had never existed on paper, and could never, therefore, be enforced anywhere but in a man's own sense of honour. Across the river, in the offices where Adi's name was stitched into every product, the fury was immediate, and it did not fade quickly. Whatever thin thread of goodwill had grown between the cousins at Melbourne, all those years before, had just been cut cleanly in front of an audience of many millions. The two houses never really recovered their footing with one another after that. The fathers by this point were old men, and had not exchanged a civil word directly in over 20 years. Not since the shelter, not since the split, not since the courtroom testimonies of the American years. The sons carried on the argument in boardrooms and stadium tunnels across 3 continents, with a fluency and a scale their fathers could never have imagined from a shared attic workshop, But it was, underneath all the boardrooms and all the stadiums, still the same argument. It had simply learned to travel, and the two old men on the river, whatever they made of it all from a distance, kept doing what they had done for over 20 years by then, which was to say nothing to one another at all. And then, in the autumn of 1974, the argument lost one of the two men who had begun it. Rudolf Dassler died in October of that year, at 76 years of age, after a long illness in his lungs. He had spent the last quarter century of his life within sight of his brother's factory, close enough on a clear day to see smoke from its chimney, and had not in all that time exchanged with him a single word that either man troubled to record. He had lived long enough to watch his son build Puma into a company that sold shoes on every continent, and long enough to see his own name, sewn once into a leaping cat, become known across the whole of the sporting world. There was no reconciliation, even at the end. But a short statement crossed the river, in the family's name, declining to say more out of simple decency, and his own daughter, it is said, was seen at Rudolf's funeral. Whatever grief, or relief, or private reckoning the news brought to the house on the other bank, the rest of it stayed there, behind closed doors, unspoken, in keeping with everything else about this particular silence. Armin, who had spent a decade and more learning the business abroad in Salzburg and beyond, stepped into his father's place at Puma without any great pause in the company's affairs. The workshop his father and uncle had once shared, in a laundry room in a single house, had by now grown far too large to notice the absence of any one man for long, however much that man's name was stitched into its history. Adi Dassler outlived his brother by not quite 4 years. He died in September of 1978, at 77 years of age, his heart finally giving out after a lifetime spent, quite literally, on his feet. Bent over laths and benches long after other men of his standing would have retired to watch from an office window. He had never fully retired, the story goes, and was still visiting his own workshops in his last years, still running a thumb along a stitched edge, the way he had done as a young man in his mother's wash kitchen, checking, out of a habit that had never left him, that the seam would hold. He had built by then one of the largest sporting goods companies on earth, from that same wash kitchen and a converted bicycle. He had never, by any account that survives, made peace with his brother. Horst, who had spent almost 20 years building his father's name across France and beyond, came home to Herzogenaurach afterward to take his place at the head of the firm his father had founded, leaving the business he had built abroad in trusted hands. The son who had once been sent away as barely more than a boy to prove himself in a foreign country, returned now as the man responsible for everything his father had made. A workshop grown in one long lifetime, from a single room above a laundry into a name spoken on every continent where a football was kicked or a race was run. They are both buried to this day in the same modest churchyard in Herzogenaurach, the town they built together and then divided and then never quite left. But even there, in a plot of ground barely large enough to need a map, the two graves sit at opposite corners of the cemetery, as far from one another as the ground allows, exactly the distance a river once put between them, kept now in stone instead of water. The town itself did not stop, of course, for either funeral or for both. The two factories opened their gates the next morning, as they always had, and the stitchers went to their benches, and the shift whistle sounded on both banks at its usual hour, and the shoes kept coming off the laths in their long, unhurried rows, exactly as before. A quarrel, once it has run long enough, no longer needs the men who started it. It has learned by then to keep itself going quite comfortably, on its own. Stand for a moment, if you can bear the quiet of it, in that small churchyard, in the last grey light of an evening long after both funerals. Somewhere behind you, a bell in the parish tower marks a quarter hour, the same bell that has marked every quarter hour since long before there were two factories to divide, and will go on marking them long after the last person alive, who remembers either brother's voice has gone quiet too. Two headstones at two far corners hold two names that the whole world had long since learned to say as if they were rival countries, rather than what they had once been. Two boys sharing a bed above their mother's wash kitchen, listening to the same rain on the same low roof. Whatever they became to each other afterward, they began once exactly the same. It is worth remembering that gently before we walk on. This next part of the story moves slowly. Slower even than what came before. There are no more shelters to climb into, no more insults to carry for the rest of a life. The brothers are gone now, both of them, each at his own end of the same quiet ground, and what remains is a town that must learn how to go on, and two companies that must learn how to be themselves, without the men who made them. So let yourself settle a little further into the mattress. Nothing sudden happens in this chapter. Things continue quietly, and then one by one they stop. That is the whole shape of it. Watch it the way you would watch a light go out in a window across the street. Not because anything dramatic has happened, but because it is late and someone, somewhere, has finally gone to bed. In the two factories, for a while yet, the ordinary rhythm holds. The same whistle at the same hour, the same shift of cobblers filing in past the same gate, the same smell of leather and glue rising off the same worn benches you sat at, a little earlier tonight in another chapter. Nobody in either canteen speaks much of the brothers who started all this. There is little reason to, by now. The awl still needs threading, the last still needs its boot, and a working morning does not pause for grief that belongs mostly to people already retired or already gone. The rhythm carries on because rhythms are stubborn things. They outlast the reasons that first started them, the way a clock keeps its own steady time long after the man who built it has left the room. After Adi's death, it was his widow Coda who kept the works going. She had always run the sales side, the exports, the deals, and she stepped into the gap her husband left the way a tide comes in to fill a rock pool without ceremony, because the water has nowhere else to go. Under her hand the firm kept growing, kept its place as the largest maker of sports shoes on earth. Hundreds of thousands of pairs cut and stitched and packed every single day. But she was not young herself, and on the last day of 1984, she died and the running of the company passed at last to her son. Horst had been the one sent out into the world years before, to France, to the Olympic committees, to the quiet rooms where sport and money were learned to speak the same language. He was his father's son in ambition, and his uncle's son in charm, people said, though nobody who had known both brothers ever said it kindly. He took the whole business in hand now, father's house and mother's ledgers together, and for 2 years he ran it the way Adi never quite could, as a single global machine, humming in dozens of countries at once. And then, in the spring of 1987, Horst Dassler died too. He was 51 years old. Cancer, the doctor said, had been working on him quietly for some time, the way these things do, without asking permission or giving warning. He left behind a company larger than either of his parents had ever dreamed of, and no one this time standing ready in the family to take it on. Consider for a moment what it means for a family firm to run out of family. It is not the same as running out of money or running out of ideas. It is running out of a particular kind of person, someone with a name on the gate and a lifetime's obligation folded into their own skin, who wakes each morning already knowing which factory is theirs to worry about. Adi had that. Coda had it by marriage and by will. Horst had it, perhaps, more completely than either of them, having been raised inside the business the way other boys are raised inside a faith. Adi and Coda's 4 daughters were still there, still its heirs, still holding their shares, but none stood ready to run the thing itself. And so, in the spring of 1987, there was nobody left in the family who could. Picture that boardroom, if you like, in the weeks after. The chair at the head of the table, empty. The telephone on the desk, unringing for once. Outside the window, the factory continues exactly as it always has. The same shifts, the same whistles, the same river sliding past under the same grey Bavarian sky. But upstairs, where the family had always sat, there is, for the first time in 60 years, no Dassler in the room. The heirs, the story goes, did what grieving families with a great fortune often do. They handed the running of things to a manager, a stranger to the name, brought in to hold the company steady while everyone worked out what came next. It did not go well. Within 2 years, the firm that had clothed Olympic champions and World Cup winners was posting losses in the tens of millions. An old, proud machine, suddenly unsure of its own footing, the way a dancer stumbles the moment she stops trusting her feet. And so, in 1990, the family let it go. A French businessman named Bernard Tapie borrowed a very large sum of money, something over 1.5 billion francs, by most tellings, and took control of Adidas, buying some 4/5 of it at a stroke. For the first time since a young man in a laundry room had oiled his first Cobbler's last, the company carried the Dassler name on every shoe it made, and the family that had built it held almost none of it. The house that Adi built now belonged, on paper at least, to men who had never set foot in Herzogenaurach. Herzo, as the town still calls itself, in the easy shorthand of people who have always lived there, and who knew the place only as a line of figures in a ledger. Nobody in the town, the story goes, quite knew how to feel about it. There was relief in some quarters that the firm would carry on at all, under anyone's ownership, rather than fold entirely and take half the town's livelihood down with it. And there was something quieter too, harder to name, a kind of homesickness, perhaps, for a company that had always, whatever its faults, belonged to somebody you could point to on the street. Now it belonged to a Frenchman most of the workforce had never met, and would sign before long its wage slips under names that changed again, and changed once more after that. It would be some years yet, and another change of hands, before the company found its feet again under new stewardship, and, eventually, a public listing on the stock exchange. But that part of the story belongs to accountants and shareholders now, and not to the family. And a family story, once the family has left it, has a way of going quiet very fast. Across the river, the quiet had come earlier, and it sat there longer. Rudolph's son, Armin, had carried Puma forward through the 60s and into the 70s, matching Adidas boot for boot, deal for deal, in a rivalry that by now had rather less to do with two brothers and rather more to do with two boardrooms. But the smaller house on the smaller side of the water had always run on tighter margins, and tighter margins forgive less. Through the 1980s, the figures slid the way a boat slides once the tide has turned, not suddenly but steadily, a little further out with every year. By the turn of the 1990s, Puma had gone 8 years without a profit. In America, the business stood at the very edge of bankruptcy. The 3 stripes across the river, 3 stripes bought once for the price of 2 bottles of whiskey, though that is a story already told, had become the smart, expensive name. Puma had become the shoe on the discount shelf, the one your mother bought because it was cheaper, and everybody in the shop knew it. It is worth pausing here, gently, on what it must have felt like, inside that building. Not a collapse. Nothing so dramatic as that. Only a long, grey stretch of years in which the machines kept turning, and the wages kept being paid, and everybody privately understood that the company they worked for was no longer quite what it had been, and might not be for very much longer. A kind of held breath, going on, past the point where you expect it to end. Walk with me for a moment, through a warehouse on the Puma side of the Orach, sometime around the turn of the 1990s. Rows and rows of boxes stacked to the rafters, more shoes made than the world seemed willing to buy. A single bulb hangs from a long flex overhead, and somewhere a draft finds it, and it swings very slightly, so that the shadows of the boxes lean first one way and then the other, slow as a held breath. Nobody is working this late. The whole building has the particular hush of a place that is still, technically, a going concern, and privately wondering whether it will still be one this time next year. The rescue, when it came from a young man barely out of his 20s. Jochen Zeitz was 30 years old when he took charge of Puma in 1993, the youngest chief executive of any publicly listed company in Germany, and he inherited a firm that had spent most of a decade losing money. His answer was not to fight Adidas on Adidas's own ground. Not speed, not performance, not the language of stopwatches and Olympic finals. He turned the company instead toward colour and cut and style, leaning into a side of the business the firm had opened decades before he arrived. A suede sports shoe that Puma had first put on the street back in the 1960s, made for wearing rather than racing. Zeitz did not invent that idea. He put the whole company's weight behind a shoe already sitting quietly in its own history, as the future rather than a curiosity. Something you might wear simply because it looked well on a Saturday, pushed harder and wider than it had ever been pushed before. It was, in its own small way, as strange an idea as a bicycle-driven leather mill in a laundry room had once been. Take the thing everyone already knows, and turn it slightly, patiently, until it becomes something nobody expected. It took years. It took the closing of factories and the moving of production far from Herzogenaurach, out to places where a shoe could be made for less. But slowly, through the middle of the decade and beyond, the figures turned. Sales climbed toward billions rather than millions. The share price, over the years that followed, rose by some extraordinary multiple of what it had been. A company that had nearly disappeared, quietly rebuilding itself into something that could stand, again, across the water from its old rival, without embarrassment. Neither house, notice, was rescued by a Dassler. Not one. The name stayed on the buildings, on the boxes, on the tongues of the shoes themselves. But the hands doing the rescuing, on both sides of the river now, belonged to people who had never known the brothers, never stood in the air raid shelter, never had to choose a side by choosing a factory gate. The feud had outlived the family that started it. The way a fire, banked carefully enough, outlives the man who first struck the match. And the town, meanwhile, kept doing what the town had always done. The old habits do not vanish the moment the reasons behind them die. A boy in Herzogenaurach in the 1990s still glanced, without quite meaning to, at the shoes of the boy walking toward him. Still knew, by some instinct nobody ever had to teach him twice, which side of the river a stranger's feet belonged to. Grandparents still nodded toward one pub and steered gently away from another. The two football clubs still lined up in their two kits, Adidas red and white on one pitch, Puma's colours on the other, and nobody watching from the touchline could quite have told you, if you had stopped and asked them, why exactly it still mattered so much, only that it did. That is how customs survive in the end. Not because anyone remembers clearly the shelter, or the mutter that started it, or two brothers who could not sit in the same room, but because a gesture, repeated often enough, by enough people for long enough, stops needing a reason at all. It simply becomes the shape of the place. The bent neck, the sideways glance at a stranger's feet, outlived the men whose quarrel put it there. The way a scar outlives the wound, smooth now and painless and permanent. Below the two factories, company headquarters now, though the older word still fits them somehow better, the Aurach went on doing what it had always done. It is not a grand river. It never was. A modest brown-green current, narrow enough in places to throw a stone across, sliding under its old stone bridge exactly as it had when two boys first heard it from their mother's washing line. It had watched the whole of this. The laundry room, the first spikes, the shelter, the split, the two brothers growing old without a word between them. The sons who carried the fight on, the family at last, letting go of the wheel entirely, and it had done through every year of it, precisely nothing at all except flow. Think of everything this small water has been asked to witness, without once being asked its opinion. The mother's washing, rinsed and wrung, and hung to dry within earshot of it. The two factory walls that rose in time on either bank, each pretending, for decades, that the other simply wasn't there. The whistles that called men to work on both sides at once, morning after morning, so that for a moment, twice a day, the whole town moved to the same two-note rhythm, whichever gate it was walking toward. None of it troubled the water in the slightest. It has its own work to do further downstream, and it has never once paused to take sides. There is something almost merciful in that. 100 years of human stubbornness, running its whole course beside a river that never once took a side. The water doesn't glance at anyone's shoes. It has somewhere to be, and it goes there at its own unhurried pace, the way it will go on going there long after the last person who remembers any of this has fallen at last asleep. Come with me now, gently, into the town itself, as it stands tonight. It is evening in Herzogenaurach, and you are walking, the way you sometimes walk in a dream. Unhurried, unquestioned, free to go wherever the story takes you. There is nowhere you need to be, and nobody waiting on you, and so your feet simply carry you, at their own slow pace, along streets that have heard every part of the story you have spent the whole night listening to. The air is cool and smells faintly of cut grass, and somewhere a dog barks once and then thinks better of it. The street lamps are coming on, one by one, along a road that runs down toward the water. On your left, set back behind lawns and glass, a cluster of low modern buildings glows warm against the coming dark. Offices, an arena. A name spelled out in restrained letters somewhere near the entrance, though you needn't trouble yourself reading it. This is the Adidas side now, world-facing, glass-walled, built for a company that sells its shoes on every continent, and yet the address on the gate still carries the old founder's own name. Quietly, the way a house keeps the name of the man who first laid its foundation stone. Cross the water, and the same is true on the other bank. A shorter walk than you might expect. Perhaps 20 minutes, unhurried from one set of gates to the other, though for the better part of a century it might as well have been the whole width of the world. Here the buildings wear the other name, and the other colours, and somewhere inside, at this hour, the last few lit windows are the cleaners, and the security guard, and whoever it is that always stays a little later than everyone else. Between the two clusters of light, on both banks, something close to 7,000 people now earn their living from these two houses. Most at the Adidas headquarters, a smaller share at Puma's, though many now commute in from other towns, rather than sleeping within sight of either gate. The two factories that once glared at each other across a river have become, in the end, simply the town's two biggest reasons for getting up in the morning. The streets nearest each headquarters carry the founder's own names now, quietly. The way a town sometimes folds its history into the very business of giving directions. Ask for one address, and you are, in effect, asking after Adi. Ask for the other, and you are asking after Rudolf, though nobody phrases it quite that way any longer. Delivery vans still cross the bridge all day between the two sides, carrying nothing more dramatic than parcels and post, weaving between the two gates as easily as if no river and no century of silence had ever stood between them. Walk on. There is no need to hurry any part of this. A little further in, away from the glass and the car parks, the streets narrow and the houses grow older, and here, behind a low gate, stands a plain house with a tiled roof, built at the turn of the last century, 1900 or thereabouts. It looks like nothing at all. A family home, timbered and unremarkable, the sort of house you would walk past 100 times without a second glance. This is where it began. Somewhere behind that brick, in a room that once held a mangle and a copper and lines of drying washing. A young man just home from a war cut his first pair of shoes by hand in the year 1920 in his mother's own wash kitchen. His brother would not join him for a few years yet. The house still belongs to a private family today, and there is no door open for visitors, no reason for you to knock. Only a small interpretive sign nearby, naming what happened here, and the building itself, still standing, keeping the rest of its old secret the plain way that old houses do, simply by continuing to exist. Ivy has taken one whole corner of the brick, slowly, over decades, the way ivy does when nobody minds it enough to cut it back. A single light burns behind a curtain on the ground floor tonight, and you will never know, and do not need to know, who is sitting behind it, or whether they think, even once in a passing evening, about the two brothers who once shared that same small kitchen. There was another house once, nearer the factory. A villa the whole family shared for a time, in the years before the shelter and the split. Addie's family on one floor, Rudolph's on another, the parents above them both, the way 3 separate rooms in a single chest sometimes hold 3 quite different quarrels at once. That villa is gone now. It was taken down only a handful of years ago, over some objections from people in the town who felt something ought to have been kept. And where it stood, there is simply space now, waiting to become something else. Even the buildings that remember the brothers together are running out, one by one. The laundry room house held on, the shared roof did not. Not far from here, in the town's own museum, a quieter kind of memory is kept. The cases are not large, and the rooms around them are usually empty at this hour, or nearly so. This is not a grand institution built to celebrate 2 famous names. It is a small town museum, the sort with creaking floors and a volunteer at the desk, that might just as easily be devoted to the parish church, or the old mill, or the history of the market square, and instead happens to have inherited one of the more improbable stories in the whole history of sport, and does its modest best to tell it honestly, without picking a side, the way the river outside never picks one either. Old photographs, brown and creased, of 2 young men standing outside a workshop that has not yet chosen a name. A ledger open to a page of careful figures. A row of shoes behind glass. Leather gone dark and stiff with age, stitched by hand in a workshop that no longer exists in the form it once had. Look closely, if you like, at the faces in those old photographs, though you will not make out much in this light. 2 brothers who once looked, by every account, remarkably alike, before the years and the war and the shelter carved 2 entirely different men out of the same set of features. Among them, under its own small light, a pair of spikes, cut, the story goes, in the very style worn on a running track in Berlin in the summer of 1936, when an American sprinter took 4 gold medals in shoes, stitched not far from where you are standing now, while a chancellor who believed such things impossible looked on from the stands. Whether this precise pair ever touched that precise track is not a thing the museum quite claims, and it is not a thing we need to claim either. What matters standing here is simpler than provenance. Somewhere in this town, in a room like a workshop, a man once bent over leather and thread believing that a better made shoe could carry a runner a fraction of a second further than anyone thought possible. And, for one afternoon in a stadium built to celebrate something ugly, the fastest man alive wore his shoes to 4 gold medals, and the world drew its own conclusions about the leather and thread beneath his feet. You could stand here a long while, the way you stand in any small museum late in the day, when the light through the windows has gone the colour of weak tea, and nobody is hurrying you past anything. Somewhere in a drawer you cannot see, the volunteers keep newer things too. A supporter's scarf in one set of colours, a key ring in the other, a photograph of a footballer, decades on, still lacing a boot stitched not far from this room. The collection grows a little every year, in the way collections do, one small donated object at a time, each one somebody's whole private memory of a town that never quite stopped taking sides, even after it forgot why. But there is further to walk yet. Follow the path down toward the sports ground, where the town's two clubs still play, still in their two sets of colours, though the crowds who watch them now come for the football rather than the flag. The floodlights are off tonight, and the goalposts stand bare and pale against the dark, and the whole ground has the hush that any empty pitch carries after the whistle has long since blown and the crowd has long since gone home. But picture it lit for a moment and full the way it was on one particular afternoon, not so very long ago as these things are measured. It was on a pitch very like this one. The actual ground belonged to the Adidas side of the river, that particular year. That something unlikely happened on an ordinary Monday in the autumn of 2009. For 6 decades, since the brothers stopped speaking, nobody from one company had shaken hands, in public, with the head of the other. And then, on that one afternoon, in support of a day set aside around the world for peace, 40 employees from both firms pulled on shirts made specially for the occasion, half the badges folded together on a single strip, and divided themselves not by company, but by the colour of a bib, black against white, and simply played. The 2 chief executives took the field themselves, one in goal, one in midfield, on the very same side, and their team won, in the end, by 7 goals to 5, though nobody remembers the score half so well as what came after the final whistle. The 2 men shook hands, in front of everyone, cameras and colleagues and all. The first such handshake, by most tellings, that the town had seen since the war. 700 more employees stood at the touchline and watched it happen. It was by any measure a small thing, 1 match, 1 afternoon, changing nothing about the balance sheets on either side of the water. But small things are sometimes exactly the size a very old wound requires. Nobody expected the rivalry to end that day, and it did not. The 2 names still compete for the same shelf, the same sponsorship, the same young athlete's signature as fiercely as ever. But the handshake happened. It is there, if you want it, in the record. Proof that 2 houses built on a single brother's grudge could, for one afternoon at least, stand on the same patch of grass without flinching. Neither brother lived to see it, of course. It would have meant nothing to either of them, most likely, or everything. There is no way now of knowing which, and perhaps it does not matter. What matters is only this. 2 teams, mixed and unremarkable, in bibs rather than badges, on a Monday afternoon, kicking a ball about on the very turf their grandfather's quarrel had once made impossible to imagine. And now at last, the walk brings you to the place it was always going to end. The cemetery sits a little apart from the rest of the town, behind old trees, the way cemeteries usually do, a place built for quiet and generally left to keep it. Walk in through the gate and take the path that curves off toward the southwest corner, and there, among ordinary family plots, you will find Rudolph, resting with his wife and his parents, under a stone no grander than its neighbours. Then turn and walk the whole width of the grounds, every path, every row, every quiet corner of it, further than feels reasonable for 2 men who once shared a mother's washing line, until you reach the far northeastern edge, where Addy lies with his own wife and his son beside him. Notice how long that walk takes you, even at an easy pace. A cemetery is not a large place, as places go, and yet crossing it corner to corner tonight feels almost like crossing the whole town again, the factories, the river, the 2 football grounds, all folded down into a few unhurried minutes on gravel. That is, in its way, exactly what this walk has always been about. Not distance measured in meters, but distance measured in the sheer, patient will it must have taken on somebody's part to keep these 2 men apart even now, when neither of them can any longer object to being moved an inch closer. Between the 2 graves, the whole cemetery, every hedge, every gravel path, every family plot that has nothing whatsoever to do with shoes or with rivers or with a mutter in an air raid shelter 80-odd years ago. 2 brothers, born in the same small house, who built two of the most recognized names in the world between them, and who came, however it was decided, and by whoever's hand, to rest at the furthest possible remove from one another that the same patch of consecrated ground allows. A separation the town has long since taken as the feud's own last, quiet emblem, whatever the truth of how it came to be arranged. The town lies all around them, still. Both factories still lit, some evenings, later than they need to be. Both sets of colours still worn on both sides of the water, more by habit now than by conviction. The bent necks are rarer than they were, but they have not entirely gone. An old woman on the bridge tonight still glances, out of nothing but a lifetime's instinct, at the shoes of the stranger walking toward her, and finds for half a second before she catches herself that she is glad or sorry, depending on which she sees. Stand here a moment longer, if you like, at the edge of the path, between the two of them. The light is nearly gone now. Somewhere behind you, the river keeps its old unhurried pace toward the sea, exactly as it did the night two boys first heard it through the laundry room window. Somewhere ahead, in two directions at once, two gates still stand, and two names still glow above them, and neither one has spoken to the other in the better part of 100 years. No one comes here often for either of them alone anymore. The odd visitor, curious the way you are curious tonight, finds one grave and then remembers the other is somewhere across the grounds, and makes the long walk out of a kind of obligation, the way you might visit a second church in a town you're only passing through. The groundskeepers tend both plots exactly alike, with exactly the same care, and if they have any opinion at all about shoes, or rivers, or which brother was more wronged than the other, they have never once let it show in how the grass is cut. But you have walked the whole distance between them tonight. That is more than either brother ever managed. We end where we began, on the cobbles, in the lamplight, with two pairs of shoes facing one another in the dark. Look at them now, the way you looked at them at the very start of the night, before you knew whose feet they belonged to, or what a glance at a stranger's shoes could once cost a person, in a small Bavarian town, for the better part of 100 years. Two pairs of leather, worn soft with walking, set down on old stone, close enough to touch and never quite touching. The lamp above them gutters once, the way a flame does when the night has gone on long enough, and steadies again. Somewhere behind those shoes is a laundry room, and a mother's washing line, and two boys who once worked at the very same bench, shoulder to shoulder, before either of them had cause to raise his voice at the other. Somewhere behind them is a war and a shelter, and 6 words muttered by one brother that the other could never quite let go of. A river, a bridge, a town that learned, without ever really choosing to look down before it would look you in the eye. 2 factories, 2 graves, 100 years, more or less, of 2 names refusing to sit in the same room. And somewhere in all of that, very slowly, without anyone in Herzogenaurach quite deciding it should happen, the bent necks began, at last, to straighten. Not all at once, though not because anyone forgave anyone, or because either family ever quite made peace with the other. Simply because time is patient in a way that grudges are not, and time, given 100 years, and a slow green river to do its work beside, wins almost every argument in the end. The men who started it are gone. The men who might have carried it forward chose mostly to let it rest. And a town that once could not look a stranger in the eye without checking his feet first, now mostly just looks. You have walked the whole of it tonight, from a laundry room to a graveside, and you never once had to raise your voice, or take a side, or check a single pair of shoes. That was always the quiet privilege of listening to a story instead of living inside one. You got to walk both banks of the river. Both brothers would, in the end, have understood that better than almost anyone. 2 men who spent the last 30 years of their lives unable to cross a bridge that was never, in truth, more than a few dozen paces wide. You do not need to carry any of it any further than this. Not the brothers, and not their grudge, and not the war, and not the river. It was never yours to hold. It belongs to a small town on the Aurach, and to the two shoes on the cobbles in front of you, and to the lamp above them, which is burning very low now and does not intend to go out just yet, only to dim, gently, the way this whole night has dimmed around you, one slow chapter at a time. Let the shoes stay where they are. Let the lamp keep its low, steady light. Let the river, wherever it is tonight, keep sliding past, taking nothing with it that it was not already carrying. The cobbles are quiet now. The lamp is nearly out. And somewhere, at the very far ends of an ordinary little town, two old rivals lie at rest. Closer, perhaps, than either of them ever imagined they would come to being, held in the one thing they always did share without ever once admitting it. The same small patch of earth, the same slow river, the same quiet dark. Sleep well.